He knelt before her, chains already closing around his wrists, and she did not look away, not once. Grace stood in the center of her father's throne room, the marble cold beneath her bare feet, her ceremonial gown suddenly feeling like a costume she no longer recognized as her own. King Harold sat above her on a throne carved from stone older than the kingdom itself, his voice low and final. He told her she had two choices: renounce the man she loved, or lose everything she was born into. Every noble in that hall held their breath, waiting to see which daughter she would choose to be, the obedient heir or the woman who had already given her heart away. Grace looked her father directly in the eye, and in that single, unbearable second, she made a choice that would not just end a love story, but shake the foundations of the kingdom for the next 20 years. The guards moved fast once the king gave the signal, dragging Elijah backward across the marble floor, while Grace's scream tore through the silence of the court. He did not fight them. He simply kept his eyes on her, as if memorizing her face for the last time, as if some part of him already knew this was the final image he might ever have of the only woman who had ever looked at him and seen more than his poverty. Nobles whispered behind gloved hands. Guards exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody in that room, not even the king himself, understood the full weight of what was happening. They believed they were watching the end of a foolish romance between a princess and a poor man from the lower village. What they did not know was that they were watching the beginning of something far bigger, something that would test loyalty, expose secrets buried for decades, and force an entire kingdom to ask itself what it truly valued more: blood or love. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what the king did not know, what none of his advisors, his guards, or his spies had managed to uncover, was that his daughter had already made her choice 3 months earlier, in a place he never thought to look. Long before that morning in the throne room, long before chains and shouting and the cold judgment of a father who believed love was a weakness reserved for people without responsibility, Grace had already given her heart away in the quiet corner of a village market he never once thought to visit. She had already chosen a life he could not control, a love he could not silence, and a truth he was about to spend the rest of his reign trying to undo. And by the time this story reaches its end, you will understand that the real danger was never the poor man kneeling on that palace floor. The real danger was the secret Grace had been carrying inside her the entire time, a secret that would eventually force the king to face something far more painful than losing a daughter to a commoner. It would force him to face the truth about himself. To understand how a princess and a poor man from the lower village ended up at the center of a kingdom-shaking scandal, you have to understand who each of them was before their paths ever crossed. And you have to understand what the king was hiding long before his daughter ever met the man he would one day order dragged out of his throne room in chains. This is not simply a love story. This is a story about a lie that outlived the man who told it, and a king who built his entire kingdom on top of it without ever realizing the ground beneath him was never solid to begin with. 3 questions will follow you through every part of what comes next. Why would a princess risk everything for a man with nothing to his name? What was the king so afraid of that he was willing to destroy his own daughter's happiness to protect it? And when the truth finally surfaced, whose life would be ruined by it, and whose life would finally be saved? Grace was raised inside walls she did not choose. From the moment she could walk, her days were built around lessons in posture, in diplomacy, in the careful art of smiling at men she did not love, while her father negotiated her future like a piece of land to be traded. She was clever, and she was kind, but neither of those qualities mattered much inside a court, where a woman's worth was measured by the alliances she could secure. She watched her father grow more guarded with every passing year, more suspicious of strangers, more obsessed with control over things that had nothing to do with ruling a kingdom and everything to do with protecting a secret she did not yet know existed. She loved him, but she often felt like a guest inside her own home, polite and welcome, but never truly free to be herself within those palace walls. Elijah grew up on the opposite end of the same kingdom his future would one day threaten to unravel. His mother raised him alone after his father disappeared from their lives when Elijah was still a boy, too young to understand why the neighbors sometimes looked at their family with a strange mixture of pity and fear. He learned early that hard work was the only currency people like him were allowed to hold. By the time he was a grown man, he had built a small but honest trade repairing tools and carts for farmers who could not afford the merchants closer to the palace. He was respected in the lower village, not for his wealth, because he had none, but for his character, his patience, and the quiet dignity with which he carried a past he rarely spoke about, even to those closest to him. Neither of them expected their lives to intersect. Grace had learned to slip out of the palace through a servant's passage her old nurse once showed her, a secret escape she used only on the rare afternoons she could not bear another hour of court life. She would disguise herself in plain clothing and wander the lower village markets, buying bread from stalls she had no real need to shop from, simply to feel, for an hour or two, like an ordinary woman with an ordinary life. It was on one of these afternoons that her cartwheel cracked against a loose stone, spilling fruit across the dirt road in front of a small repair stall. Elijah knelt down without hesitation to help her gather it, and when their eyes met for the first time, neither of them said a word for several long seconds. He did not know she was a princess. She did not tell him. For the first time in her life, she was simply Grace, a woman with dirt on her hands and fruit rolling into the street, laughing at her own clumsiness, with a stranger who had no idea he was speaking to the future of the kingdom. Elijah offered to fix the cartwheel for free, and she offered to return the next week to pay him properly, though both of them understood, even then, that the wheel was never really the reason she came back. Over the following weeks, their conversations grew longer, their laughter grew easier, and the walls Grace had spent her entire life building around, her heart began, slowly and quietly, to come down in the presence of a man who wanted absolutely nothing from her, except her honesty. What began as stolen conversations soon became something neither of them could easily walk away from. Grace found herself counting the days until she could slip through the servant's passage again, and Elijah found himself glancing toward the market road every afternoon, hoping to catch sight of a woman he still believed was simply a merchant's daughter from across town. They spoke of small things at first, favorite meals, childhood memories, the kind of harmless conversation strangers use to test whether they want to become something more. But slowly, the conversations deepened. Grace confided in him about the loneliness of palace life, the suffocating weight of arranged expectations, the feeling of being a possession rather than a person. Elijah, in turn, spoke carefully about his father, a man he barely remembered, and a family name he had learned, from a young age, never to mention outside their home. It was Grace who first suspected something did not add up about Elijah's past. He carried himself with a quiet education that did not match the story of a man raised only in poverty. He knew things about court etiquette he should have had no reason to know. Small details, the correct way to address a visiting noble, the old customs surrounding a formal apology, fragments of knowledge that seemed to belong to a different life entirely. When she gently asked him about it one evening, Elijah grew quiet in a way she had never seen before, and simply said that his mother had once told him his father worked close to the palace, before everything changed. He did not know what that meant. He only knew that whatever happened to his father had left his family with nothing but a name people in the lower village still occasionally whispered with unease. Grace did not push him further that night, but the question stayed with her long after she returned to the palace. She began paying closer attention to the older servants, the ones who had worked in the palace long enough to remember decades she herself had never lived through. She noticed how certain names made them uncomfortable, how conversations about the early years of her father's reign were often redirected or quietly ended. She did not yet know she was circling the edges of a secret her own father had spent 20 years trying to bury. She only knew that something about Elijah's past connected, in some way she could not yet explain, to something the palace itself seemed determined to forget. And the closer she grew to him, the more that unanswered question began to feel less like curiosity, and more like a warning she did not yet know how to read. Meanwhile, the king had begun arranging what he believed would be the most important alliance of his reign. a marriage between Grace and Lord Simon Vale, the son of a powerful family from the Northern Territories. Harold framed it to his daughter as a matter of the kingdom's survival, a marriage that would secure peace along a border that had grown increasingly unstable. He did not ask whether Grace wanted this life. He simply expected her to understand her duty the way he understood his own, a duty that had, decades earlier, cost him more than he had ever admitted to anyone, including himself. Grace resisted as gently as she could, buying herself time, all while continuing to meet Elijah in secret, fully aware that the two paths of her life were moving toward a collision neither of them could avoid forever. Lord Simon was not a foolish man, and it did not take him long to notice that his intended bride's attention seemed to live somewhere far outside the palace walls. He began asking quiet questions of the staff, offering small favors in exchange for information, until one of the younger guards, eager to please a future lord, admitted he had seen the princess slipping through the old servant's passage on more than one occasion. Simon followed her the next time she left, keeping his distance, watching her walk directly into the arms of a man in worn work clothes outside a modest repair stall in the lower village. He did not confront her. He simply returned to the palace with a smile that unsettled everyone who saw it, and went straight to Chancellor Aldrich, the king's most trusted advisor, a man who had served the crown for longer than Grace had been alive. Aldrich listened to Simon's account with far more interest than the young lord expected, and for reasons Simon could not have understood at the time. The moment he heard the name of the lower village repairman's family, something cold settled behind the chancellor's calm expression. He asked Simon to keep the matter quiet for now, promising to handle it personally, and Simon, satisfied that he had proven his usefulness to the crown, agreed without question. What Simon did not know, what almost no one in the kingdom still living knew, was that Aldrich had a reason far older and far more dangerous than royal scandal, to want Elijah's family erased from the story of Ashvale forever. The chancellor's concern was never really about a princess falling for a poor man. It was about a secret he had spent 20 years believing was safely buried in the past. That night, Aldrich requested a private audience with the king, and what he told Harold behind those closed doors was carefully chosen to provoke exactly the reaction the chancellor needed. He did not mention the family name directly. He simply informed the king that his daughter had been secretly involved with a man from the lower village for months, a man of no title, no land, and no family worth mentioning. He framed it as an embarrassment, a threat to the alliance with the Northern Territories, a scandal that could unravel years of careful diplomacy if it were allowed to continue. Harold's anger in that moment was real, but it was built on a foundation Aldrich had quietly reinforced for 2 decades, a deep, almost instinctive fear of anything connected to the lower village families his own past had quietly wronged. Harold gave the order that night. Grace was to end the relationship immediately, and the man was to be removed from the kingdom's lower village and dealt with, quietly, before the northern delegation arrived for the formal marriage announcement. Grace learned of her father's order the following morning, delivered coldly by a palace guard who offered no explanation beyond the fact that the man from the market stall had already been taken into custody. She ran through the palace halls in her nightgown, past startled servants, straight into the throne room where her father sat waiting, already prepared for the confrontation he knew was coming. It was there, in front of the assembled court, summoned that morning for an unrelated matter, that Harold gave his daughter the ultimatum that would open this very story: renounce the man she loved, or lose everything she was born into. Grace's answer was not spoken in words. It was written across her face as she watched the guards drag Elijah into that same hall, chains around his wrists, his eyes never once leaving hers even as they forced him to his knees before the throne. What happened in the days immediately following that confrontation was carefully hidden from public record, but pieced together later through servant testimony, guard accounts, and letters that surfaced years afterward. Elijah was not executed, though Grace was deliberately told he had been. A cruel lie meant to break whatever hold he still had over her heart. In truth, he was quietly exiled to a distant province under a false name, a punishment designed to remove him from the kingdom without creating a martyr the lower village might one day rally behind. Grace, devastated and convinced the man she loved was dead, withdrew from court life entirely for weeks, refusing food, refusing visitors, refusing even her father, who found himself, for the first time in his reign, uncertain of how to reach the daughter he believed he was protecting. It was one of the older palace servants, a woman named Martha, who had cared for Grace since she was a small child, who first planted the seed of doubt in the grieving princess's mind. Martha had overheard two guards speaking quietly about the arrangements made for the repairman, using language that made no sense for a man who was supposed to be dead. Rather than repeat rumors that could cost her position, Martha simply encouraged Grace to ask more specific questions of the guards who had carried out the arrest, rather than accepting the second-hand account she had been given by her father's court. That small suggestion was enough to pull Grace out of her grief and into something far more useful to her: purpose. Grace began her own quiet investigation, moving carefully so as not to alert her father or Aldrich to her suspicions. She spoke individually to the guards who had been present that morning, noting the inconsistencies in their stories, small details that did not align with an execution that was supposed to have taken place. One guard mentioned a cart leaving the palace grounds that night, headed north, not toward the execution grounds south of the city. Another let slip that Elijah had been alive and speaking when he was loaded onto that cart. Grace realized, with a mixture of fury and desperate hope, that she had been lied to, and that the man she loved might still be alive somewhere beyond the borders her father controlled. Her investigation soon led her to a second, far more unsettling discovery. While searching through old palace records for any mention of the province the guard had described, Grace stumbled across a decades-old land dispute involving a family named Cole, stripped of their title and holdings after being accused of treason during the early years of her father's reign. The accusation had come, according to the records, from a trusted advisor to the crown, the same advisor who now served as her father's chancellor. Grace did not yet understand the connection, but a cold, creeping certainty began to settle over her. The same instinct she had felt months earlier, when Elijah first mentioned a father who had once worked close to the palace before everything changed. Grace understood that continuing her investigation from inside the palace walls put both herself and anyone who helped her at serious risk, and so, against every instinct of caution that had governed her entire life, she made the decision to leave. She disguised herself once more, took only what she could carry, and set out toward the province the guard had mentioned, following the faintest thread of hope that Elijah was still alive somewhere beyond her father's reach. Martha helped her slip through the same servant's passage that had once carried Grace toward stolen afternoons of ordinary happiness, and this time carried her toward something far more dangerous: the truth her father had spent 20 years trying to keep buried. The journey north was long and difficult for a woman who had never traveled without an entire retinue of guards and attendants. Grace slept in modest inns under a false name, paid for meals with coin she had never had to count before, and endured the quiet fear of a woman entirely alone in unfamiliar territory. It was in a small border town, weeks into her search, that she finally found him. Elijah was thinner than she remembered, hardened by months of exile and uncertainty, working under an assumed name for a blacksmith who asked no questions about his past. When Grace appeared in the doorway of that smithy, neither of them spoke for a long moment, each afraid the other was simply a trick of exhaustion and longing. Their reunion was not the joyful, uncomplicated moment either of them might once have imagined. Elijah had spent months believing Grace had abandoned him, told by his captors that the princess had already moved on, already agreed to marry the northern lord as her father demanded. Grace, in turn, had spent those same months believing him dead. Rebuilding trust after such deliberate cruelty took time, and honest, difficult conversation, but it also gave them something their earlier romance had lacked: a clear, unflinching understanding of exactly how far the people around them were willing to go to keep them apart. It was during one of these long conversations that Grace finally told Elijah what she had discovered in the palace records: the name Cole, the accusation of treason, and the chancellor, who had built his entire career on the ashes of that ruined family. Elijah's reaction confirmed what Grace had begun to suspect. His mother had told him almost nothing growing up, only that his father had once served the crown in some capacity before a scandal none of them fully understood tore their family apart, leaving his mother to raise him alone in humiliation and poverty. Piecing together fragments from his mother's rare, painful mentions of the past and the records Grace had uncovered, they began to understand the outline of what had truly happened decades earlier. Elijah's father, a minor court official under a young King Harold, had apparently discovered evidence of financial corruption involving a rising advisor named Aldrich. Evidence that, if made public, would have ended the chancellor's career before it truly began. Rather than allow that evidence to surface, Aldrich had moved first, quietly manufacturing accusations of treason against Elijah's father, evidence so convincing that a young and inexperienced King Harold, only recently crowned and desperate to appear strong and decisive, had ordered the family stripped of their title and holdings without a proper trial. Elijah's father had died within a few years, broken by the loss of everything he had built, leaving his widow to raise their son in the very poverty the accusation had created. Aldrich had spent the following 2 decades ensuring the Cole name faded from memory, positioning himself as the king's most indispensable advisor, all while the true architect of the crown's greatest injustice stood quietly at Harold's side, offering counsel on every decision that followed. Grace realized, with a growing sense of dread, that her father's fear of the lower village, his instinctive distrust of anyone connected to that world, his willingness to believe the worst about Elijah without ever meeting him, had all been carefully cultivated by a man who needed the king to remain suspicious of exactly the kind of truth Elijah now represented. Aldrich had not been protecting the kingdom from scandal when he pushed for Elijah's exile. He had been protecting himself from a secret he had buried alive 20 years earlier, a secret that had just returned to the palace walls disguised as a simple village romance. Grace and Elijah understood that returning to the capital carried enormous risk, but they also understood that remaining hidden meant allowing Aldrich to continue controlling the king, and by extension, the entire kingdom, through a lie that had already destroyed one family and threatened to destroy another. They traveled back toward the capital carefully, gathering what evidence they could along the way. Old letters from Elijah's mother, testimony from an aging clerk who had worked alongside Elijah's father and still remembered the accusations as suspiciously convenient, and the original palace records Grace had already uncovered before her departure. It was not an ironclad case, but it was enough to plant serious doubt, and doubt, Grace understood, was the one thing Aldrich could not survive after 20 years of carefully maintained certainty. Their return to the palace was not a quiet one. Grace requested a formal audience with her father, refusing to be turned away by guards or advisors, insisting that what she carried concerned the security of the crown itself. Harold, who had spent the months of his daughter's absence in a state of guarded worry, he refused to fully acknowledge even to himself, agreed to see her, though he had no idea what she intended to reveal. Aldrich, informed of the princess's unexpected return, arrived at the audience uninvited, positioning himself at the king's side as he had for 20 years, unaware that the woman standing before them now held the one piece of evidence that could finally unravel everything he had built. Grace laid out the evidence methodically, watching her father's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to a slow, dawning horror as the pieces connected in front of him. She reminded him of the treason case against a court official named Cole, a case Harold barely remembered clearly, having relied entirely on Aldrich's counsel at the time to guide a decision he had been too inexperienced and too frightened to fully investigate himself. She revealed that the man he had exiled months earlier, the poor repairman from the lower village, was Cole's son, and that the accusation which destroyed his family 2 decades earlier had been fabricated by the very advisor standing beside the king at that moment, to bury evidence of his own corruption. Aldrich attempted to dismiss the accusation as the desperate fantasy of a heartbroken princess trying to protect the man she loved, but his composure cracked in small, telling ways, a slight tremor in his voice, a defensiveness that did not match the calm certainty he had maintained for 20 years. Harold, watching his most trusted advisor for the first time not as a source of guidance, but as a man with something to hide, ordered a formal investigation into the original treason case, opening records that had remained sealed since before Grace was born. Within days, the aging clerk's testimony was corroborated by other retired officials who had long suspected the case against Cole had been unusually thin, men who had stayed silent for decades, out of fear of the very advisor now standing accused before the crown. The revelation shattered the court. Nobles who had spent years currying favor with Aldrich scrambled to distance themselves. The northern delegation, informed that the crown's most senior advisor stood accused of corruption and fabricated treason charges, quietly withdrew their support for the marriage alliance between Grace and Lord Simon, unwilling to associate their family name with a scandal of this magnitude. Harold, faced with the undeniable truth that he had destroyed an innocent family and exiled his own daughter's love based on the counsel of a man who had manipulated him for 2 decades, found himself confronting something far more painful than the loss of a political alliance. He was confronting the reality that the fear which had shaped so many of his decisions as king had never truly been his own. It had been planted, cultivated, and carefully maintained by a man who needed him afraid in order to remain safe himself. Aldrich's fall from power was swift once the evidence became undeniable. Stripped of his title and confined pending formal judgment, the man who had shaped 2 decades of royal policy from the shadows finally faced the same accusation of corruption he had once fabricated against an innocent official to save his own career. Harold, forced to sit through the formal proceedings that followed, listened as witness after witness described a pattern of manipulation stretching back further than even Grace had uncovered. Decisions made, alliances shaped, and fears cultivated, all to protect one man's secret at the expense of anyone who threatened to expose it. It was, for Harold, a devastating education in exactly how much of his reign had been built on foundations he never personally examined. Grace watched her father during those proceedings with a complicated mixture of anger and compassion. She understood now that Harold had not been a cruel man simply for the sake of cruelty. He had been a frightened young king, decades earlier, manipulated by someone he trusted into making a decision that haunted the rest of his reign, without his ever understanding why the fear it created never seemed to fade. That understanding did not erase what he had done to Elijah, or to Elijah's family, but it gave Grace a path towards something she had not expected to feel again, a cautious willingness to rebuild trust with the father, who had once ordered the man she loved dragged from that very throne room in chains. The formal restoration of the Cole family name took place on a quiet afternoon, without the fanfare of the scandal that had exposed it. Harold personally returned what remained of the land and title, stripped from Elijah's father 2 decades earlier, an act that could not undo the poverty and humiliation Elijah's family had endured, or bring back a father who had died broken and forgotten, but one that finally acknowledged, publicly and permanently, the truth of what had been done to them. Elijah accepted the restoration with a complicated grief of his own, grateful for the acknowledgement, but painfully aware that the father who deserved to see this moment had not lived long enough to witness it. The question of what would happen between Grace and Elijah remained, even after the truth had come to light. Harold, humbled by the events of the previous months, did not attempt to dictate his daughter's future the way he once had. Instead, he asked her, for what may have been the first time in her life, what she actually wanted. Grace's answer was immediate and unwavering. She wanted the man who had knelt in chains before her father's throne and never once looked away from her, the man who had waited, rebuilt his life under a false name, and still chosen to return to a kingdom that had once tried to erase his family from history, all for the chance to stand beside her honestly. Their eventual marriage was smaller and quieter than the grand alliance Harold had once envisioned for his daughter, but it carried a weight no political arrangement ever could have. The lower village that had once whispered about the poor repairman and the mysterious woman who visited his stall now told a very different story, one about a princess who risked everything for love, and a poor man whose family name was finally restored to the truth it always deserved. Harold, standing at his daughter's wedding, found himself reflecting on the 20 years he had spent ruling, under the influence of a fear that was never truly his own, and the daughter who had possessed the courage, at 20 years old, to challenge a lie he had never once thought to question. This story asks something uncomfortable of anyone willing to sit with it honestly. How many decisions do we make, not out of our own convictions, but out of fear someone else planted in us long ago? Fear we never bothered to examine because it arrived dressed as wisdom, or caution, or simple common sense. Harold spent 2 decades believing he was protecting his kingdom from the dangers of the lower village, when in truth, he was protecting one man's secret without ever knowing it. Grace spent her early years believing love was a luxury she could not afford, until a poor man with nothing but his honesty showed her exactly how much that belief had cost her. And Elijah spent his whole life carrying the shame of a father's disgrace, never knowing the disgrace was never his family's to carry at all. Would you have made the same choice Grace did, kneeling in that throne room, knowing exactly what it might cost you? Or would the fear of losing everything have won? Let us know what you would have done in the comments below. We genuinely want to hear it. If this story moved you, there is another one waiting that is even harder to sit with, so make sure you are subscribed and notifications are turned on, because you will not want to miss what we tell next.